Cabins are meant to be peaceful getaways, but when you're surrounded by nothing but forest, even the smallest sound can feel wrong. Story 1. I thought a cabin in the woods would be a quiet retreat, a place to hear only the rustle of leaves and the crackle of my own fire. The map had marked the spot with a tiny green dot, as if the forest itself could be reduced to a single, neat coordinate. When I drove the narrow gravel road until the trees pressed close enough to scrape the windows, I felt something shift inside me, a mixture of exhilaration and the faint, nagging sense that I was stepping into someone else's domain. The cabin was exactly what the rental photos promised, a squat log structure with a porch that sagged under the weight of years, a stone chimney that exhaled a thin plume of smoke, and windows darkened by a film of pine sap. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and something sour, like damp cloth left to rot. I set my bag down, lit a match, and watched the flames gulp the darkness. Night fell quickly. The forest outside seemed to swallow the moon, leaving only a thin silver sliver that slipped behind the treetops. I sat on the rough wooden floor, a mug of tea warming my hands, listening to the wind sigh through the branches. At first, the sounds were ordinary, a hoot of an owl, the distant snap of a twig. Then came a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin. I told myself it was the old house settling, the pine contracting in the cold. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but each page turned felt like a breath being held. The thumping grew louder, more deliberate, as if something or someone was beating a slow, patient rhythm against the cabin's skin. I stood, heart hammering, and approached the front door. The night beyond was a black canvas, the trees silhouettes against it. I could see nothing, but the thumping was now accompanied by a faint scraping, like a fingernail dragging across wood. I pressed my palm to the door, feeling the cold metal of the latch vibrate under the unseen force. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the woods. No answer, only the relentless rhythm and the scraping now moving in a circle around the cabin, as if something were pacing the perimeter. The fire in the hearth sputtered, sending a puff of ash into the air. I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow, elongated, shifting just beyond the reach of the light. I turned, and the cabin was empty, the darkness pressing in from every side. I fled to the porch, slamming the door shut behind me. The thumping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The trees leaned inward, their branches creaking like knuckles. The humming swelled, and a cold, wet breath brushed the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back. I ran, stumbling over roots, the cabin's windows flashing briefly. There, reflected in the glass, I saw a face. Not a face I could recognize, but a hollowed mask of bark and moss, eyes deep pits of darkness. It stared directly at me, unblinking, as the humming turned into a chorus of whispers. "You were never meant to be alone." I burst out of the woods onto the road, gasping for air, the distant cabin a smear of black against the night. When I finally reached my car, the engine refused to start. I turned back, and the forest was silent, the cabin's windows dark as the void. But in the far distance, just beyond the trees, I could hear the faint echo of that same thumping, steady, patient, waiting. I never drove that road again. I never spoke of what I saw, for the words feel like an invitation. And sometimes when the wind is still, I hear it. Soft, rhythmic beats, as if something is knocking on the walls of my own mind, reminding me that the woods never truly let you go. Story 2. The pine canopy swallowed the sky, and the wind whispered through the branches like a secret that refused to be spoken. I had chosen this cabin for its solitude, a rust-red shack perched on the edge of a forgotten lake, miles from the nearest road. The map had marked it vacant and rental, but it gave no warning about the silence that settled over the water at dusk. The first night was a blessing. I lit a fire, the crackle of wood the only sound that dared to compete with the night's breath. I drank the cheap bourbon I'd brought, feeling the warm haze settle into my bones. As the fire died, I heard it. A faint metallic scrape against the porch railing, followed by a low thud that seemed to come from the very earth beneath my feet. I told myself it was a branch, a deer, the mind of a man alone too long in the dark. I pulled the blanket tighter and stared into the blackness beyond the window. The trees were silhouettes, their limbs clawing at the sky. The lake was a sheet of ink, mirroring nothing but the stars that the clouds hid. At 2 a.m., the noises returned, louder, more deliberate, a slow, deliberate shuffle on the porch, as if someone, or something, was testing the boards. My heart thudded in my throat. I lay still, listening to the rhythm of my own breath. Then a voice, just barely audible, muttered a word I could not decipher, a guttural rasp that seemed to come from the wooden walls themselves. I forced myself up, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The porch light was off. The lantern I'd left on the table inside flickered weakly through the window. I stepped onto the porch, the smell of damp pine thick in my nostrils, and peered into the darkness. Nothing moved. The lake was still, its surface unbroken, but the wind had shifted, carrying a faint, metallic scent. Blood? Rust? A sudden crack split the night as a branch snapped under a weight that was not a branch. Something, or someone, was on the other side of the cabin, pressing its palm against the far wall, the wood splintering under the pressure. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a shiver that ran from the porch to my spine. I ran back inside, slamming the door shut. I bolted the latch with trembling hands, the metal cold against my skin. The lantern sputtered and died, leaving the room in a black that seemed to swallow even the darkness outside. I could hear it now, a slow, steady breathing, not mine. It was coming from the windows, from the walls, from the very air that pressed against the glass. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice cracking like dry twigs. No answer came, only a soft, wet smacking sound, like a tongue against a pallet, right behind the door. I turned, and the wood was slick with something dark, a wet sheen that reflected the faint moonlight leaking through the cracks. I didn't wait to see what would come through. I grabbed the old hunting knife hanging above the fireplace and backed toward the back door. My fingers slipped on the cold metal as the presence moved, its weight shifting, settling against the far wall with a sigh that sounded eerily like relief. Outside, the woods were alive with rustling. The lake's surface rippled, as if something large had brushed its depths. I burst through the back door, the pine needles biting my palms, and ran, blindly, into the darkness, the cabin's silhouette shrinking behind me. I didn't stop until the road appeared, the headlights of a passing truck cutting through the black. I slammed the doors, gasped for air, and told the driver my story. He laughed, a hollow sound, and said, "There's no cabin out there. The lake was drained years ago. The only thing left is the old foundation, nothing but moss and stone." I stared back toward the woods. The lake was a dry basin, its bed exposed, the cabin nothing more than a pile of broken beams, half buried in the earth. Yet in the distance, a faint, metallic scrape echoed once more, and a low thud resonated from the ground beneath my feet. The night breathed in, and I realized I had never truly left the cabin. It had simply followed me, waiting in the dark for the next lonely traveler who dared to seek isolation among the trees.